All right, good evening. Welcome to the January 7th, 2020 meeting of the Hamilton Planning Board. It's a few minutes after 7 o'clock. On our agenda tonight, we'll be discussing the Open Space and Farmland Preservation Development Bylaw. We'll be reviewing the Attorney General opinion regarding the Hamilton zoning bylaw, and we'll be discussing board business, our 2019 annual report, and minutes. So first thing on the agenda is the OSFPD bylaw. Patrick, can you just kind of bring us up to date on where we are, what we've done so far in terms of outreach and so forth, please?
Just as a bit of backdrop, you'll recall as part of our residential master plan and the housing production plan preparation, the consultant had advised us that we need to look at some of our bylaws in terms of simplifying them, making them more workable, and where it's appropriate, making them more, or providing a little more development incentive in a way that makes them a likelihood of allowing us to succeed in what our goal was, which is to diversify our housing stock. So one of the things that we've known for a while, and our consultant had brought it back to us, is that this open space and farmland preservation development bylaw has some real potential, but it's about 100% longer than it needs to be. And so in the last few weeks, I've made some changes to it. Rick has made a number of changes to it. We've sent that out to members. We've invited some developers to come. As a matter of fact, at our next meeting on January 21st, Tom Ford's supposed to be here. He's reviewing it in the meantime and going to be bringing some suggestions and observations to work with us on. So, as I'd mentioned, the text that you have has dropped the text down by about 50%. I had a number of sidebar questions that you'll see in the document there, areas where I think that we need to review. We need to, reaffirm things like how much parking do we want, how much density do we want to provide for, other kinds of things. So that's kind of where we're at.
Great. Thank you. So I think even before the meeting started a little bit, we were just talking about, in my mind, what we really want to accomplish with this, and this is our chance to revamp this and make this work. Obviously it hasn't in the past. It's never been used. It's been tried to be used, but it hasn't been able to be. So, I'd like to kind of get into, somewhat the purpose of it. The purpose isn't too badly defined, but how flexible do we want to make this? Mark, you had a comment about, or maybe it was Peter, about allowing different types of housing, whether it's cluster or cottage or so forth. How do we best do that? And just make it flexible for a developer to at least be able to bring something for us to look at. I mean, it still is a special permit, but I mean that's kind of my goal here is you got to make these things flexible enough and attractive enough for them to be used. So, what's the best way of doing that? And before we really get into the nitty gritty of it, what's the overall purpose? Right? Is the purpose what we want it to be? And what does it apply to? What size properties and so forth? So, and where? So, I don't know if anybody has any comments on that.
I contend that there are very few properties that could be developed with something like this, and I will come next time with the list of all the properties in town. And when we were doing the master plan, I think we ended up with 17 estate properties. Those are the typical things. Meadowbrook and the Winthrops, they're really the only large properties which are sort of in agricultural use and that could be rescued from that use to have development. And maybe a developer will be hard put to try and figure out how to get real density and value. So that I think those might be two properties. I think all the great estate properties still ought to be looked at, but we treated them differently than the OSFPD properties. Peter Britton has one, but you know, it's all, I get, my contention would be most of the properties, they came traditionally out of current land use, which was mostly agriculture, and the owners have put greenbelt restrictions on it and tried to seek value by the tax advantages of a conservation restriction. So I don't think there are many left. But I'll come in and work with Patrick and we'll go through that list and see where they are. If there are any possible that would ever come out into, we probably can designate them. But that's not to say I know anything about the business district. I think that's just crazy.
No.
To say this applies to the business district. Because there are no 10-acre parcels in the business district.
Right.
Yeah, I had
I think that's fair.
that same thought, Peter, because, you know, here's a bylaw tool that you want to be able to utilize to permanently protect open space, make it usable, make it vital, make it a visual element, however it environmentally fits the site. And that's not the context of downtown, nor, I suspect, what we would want property immediately around it to be.
So I think we don't have that list of properties, although I can think of,
I'll bring it for the next meeting.
I can think of several that it could immediately apply to, or very near in the future apply to. The Rich property off Route 22 is in play.
Especially that Meadowbrook,
That's Meadowbrook.
So that's certainly one. And then Gordon Seminary is likely to be in play at some point in the future. So there are some opportunities to apply that. But I think Brian's right. We ought to sort of think about what it is, you know, rather than saying, well, it has to be 10 acres, let's drop that and say, what is it that we want to accomplish here? Housing diversity is something that, you know, everybody's been talking about, but now it's about how to try and apply that. You know, whether it's a 5-acre lot, do you want that subdivided into 5 single homes, or do you want to try and apply some version of this bylaw to it? You preserve 2.5 acres, and you've got 2.5 acres you can build on it. Now, on 2.5 acres, you could have 10 units if you wanted to. So I think we're trying to, in my mind, is figure out what do we want to do with this? Yes, we'd like to preserve open space to the degree possible on lots of some size. Housing diversity certainly is something everybody's talking about, rather than large single-family homes, which chew up a lot of land and are not necessarily paying for themselves. If you've got more than 2 kids in the school system, they aren't. So what is it that we're trying to accomplish here?
Well, Mark is a good one to have because he went through the Peary property and tried to come up with clusters, 2 clusters on the Perry property and then preserve a lot of pasture land and open space and so forth, which was in horse use, and that would have been preserved. But now we've got big additional estates on that property. The town didn't get into it.
Mark Johnson, Patton Drive. Yeah, we had two clusters on there. I think they were like 16 and 22 units each. You know, one at two different spots. But they actually were developers who were in the business of building cottage housing and were accustomed to really small sites, parking away from the unit, some common storage areas that were not adjacent to each property. Sort of some of them were clustered in common areas, some of them were not, just because one of the parcels that Peary was sort of long and thin, so you couldn't do a common there. But the development community was willing, you know, actually gave the town bids and said we would do that if this is what it looked like. So it is feasible. I mean, you know, the town obviously had a large discussion about whether or not it wanted cottage housing.
What was the acreage of the Peary property? It was 120 or something?
No, 82 total acres, and doing the two clusters and also building out the stables as housing as well lets you save 60 of them. So, and you'd still have, I think there were 6 or 7 acres in the front that were large fields, and those were recreation fields that the town was going to be able to use, because you'd be able to it's within walking distance of the high school, so they wouldn't have transportation needs. So the idea of having a couple of fields there was sort of integral to the design. But the town made its decision there, and then later it decided cottage housing was interesting, but not enough to change the bylaw. So I mean, I think the prospects are there, but it did show you how cottage housing with that type of density would let you save a lot of open space.
Yeah.
Let me offer up a couple thoughts on this. First of all, the value of open space for the town, really depends on the open space being of a certain scale. So if you save,
Based on a what scale?
having a certain minimum scale.
Okay.
So if you save 2 acres here and 3 acres there and 1 acre there, it doesn't add up to anything. People can't hike through it, they can't cross-country ski on it or do anything else. Whereas, so you have to be careful here. I would have a threshold on size of this that's much larger than 10 acres. This is for large parcels where we can get 20, 30, 40, 50 acres set aside for town use. And that'll be something people can really use, as opposed to, you know, 2 lots over here and 3 lots over here that are prevented from development. The second thing is I would take a little disagreement on what actually happened in the end on the Peary property. So we would have had 20 cottage housing units. Instead, we got 5 or 6, including the original house.
Well, there were.
I think they're
5, well, let's just say 5. We got 5 estates. I know that each of those houses are appraised at more than $2.5 million. So they are contributing, let's say, $15 million to the town's tax base. And the 20 cottage houses probably wouldn't have contributed any more. And
Was how many units though, Mark? It was 38 or 40, right?
I'll send the board a complete analysis of those.
But here's the point. I can guarantee you that the 5 estates are using absolutely zero level public services. Don't have any children in the school. Most of the people are older. They're using $15 million of appraised value, which goes, you know, right to the bottom line of the town. Whereas, you know, the question of what we would get out of 20, 30, 40 cottage housing units there is, you know, really up for debate, whether or not the tax payments of those units would equal the service usage. Whereas the 5 estates that were put on there are all huge surpluses to the town.
Well, right now.
Even, it doesn't matter. At $2.5 million, when the average house is $700,000, if they have average school children, they're still well, you know, deep into the blue.
No, but you're talking just taxes, so there's no open space there that was,
Well, no, that's true. There's no open space for people to tromp around in, but visually, you drive along,
Nothing.
you see nothing,
so-
nothing. Wait, hold on, let me finish. There you see absolutely nothing.
Right.
There's lots, so,
Wow.
the point is, I wouldn't want to rush to judgment on this and say that, oh my goodness, look what we got, 5 estates and it's horrible. No, in fact, we got 5 estates that pay millions of dollars more in taxes that you can't even see because they're set back from the road, and the alternative would have been a development of a large number of units whose fiscal surplus would certainly be open to debate. Okay, and you would see them from the road. You would certainly see them from the road. Now, we might have gained 20, 30, 40, 50, depending on how the deal was struck. Acres of open space. So that was the trade-off. But you would see the 30 units for sure.
No, you wouldn't.
You don't.
That period land.
We're going to be way
you could have made
going to
sure
be
you did.
way back there where the ground is soft and marshy.
you can build all back there, it was fine.
All right, I'm just saying this is open to debate.
I've
I'm
studied a
getting
couple
to-
of those lots back there significantly, and they were fine to build
There's
on,
the
but.
man who studied it, so.
Well, the other thing, so you kind of contradicted yourself a little bit from the beginning to the end there about open space, and you said, what's the point of saving, 3, 4
I'm
acres?
saying
Hold
the
on, let me fin- let me
the
finish.
Peary property
Let me
was
finish.
a
Hold on
good
second.
case. It was a good
It
case.
was. I'm not saying it wasn't, but you made a point of not saving a few acres, 4 or 5 acres, for use or visual, right? But then you said, well, now you've got all this visual open space that can't be used by anyone other than its owners. So that's kind of a contradiction. So I would argue that even if you did save 3, 4, 5 acres for visual open space that could be used by the people in the whatever development this is, wherever it is, then that's valuable versus saving 30 or 40 acres for use by everybody, right? Which is good too, but we have a ton of that, right? So I think having visual open space in some cases is just as important as usable open space. So if you save even smaller portions of that in key areas, I think that's a noble goal as well. So.
If I may, smaller parcels offer huge connectivity opportunities for people to walk between one neighborhood and the next. And it's something that, as soon as you have a big house built and maybe they put a fence, maybe they put a pool, that you get this.
But they have to be
isolation.
adjoining in order for people to walk them. The problem is they are not. They are town
this is actually
property.
not period.
They are
This
town.
is-
Hold on.
Let
They are
him finish,
town
Bill.
property. So you have.
Let him finish.
You have
Let
1
him
acre
finish,
here
Bill.
and 1 acre here. You have to go through people's yards to connect them.
So the point is, if you actually have opens, a current 2-acre parcel that is developable, someone could put a big house there and put a fence around the whole thing, and nobody can walk through that house or on the way to school or on the way to the park or anywhere. And we can see that right in Patton Drive. There was a 3-acre common driveway scenario between Patton Drive and Winthrop School. The neighborhood walked through that open space when it was developed. We couldn't. Right? So it's just not a problem, but people had to walk across Bay Road, walk down, or go out to the horse trail and around. But it was very different. The point.
It was developed. It was developed.
It was developed. The big white house became a common driveway with 2 bigger houses in back. The point is, small parcels may not have as much impact on a wildlife and a view, but they could be very impactful for the local neighborhood. So I just didn't want to. I wanted to just throw that out that there is real value locally to small pockets of open space for you to consider. Mm-hmm. On Peary, half the cottage houses were going to be elderly. So you're absolutely right. 2/3 of our budget is schools, and if it was all just regular family housing, Peary could have been a very high cost consequence. You get the tax revenue, but you have the high cost consequence. We addressed that at Peary by having half of it targeted for senior housing. It didn't happen, but that was a way to mitigate the impact there. As a perspective, the 12 units at Patton Ridge generate $155,000 in tax revenue. Those 12 units. If you had $15 million of, spread out over 5 houses, $3 million each at Peary, that would give you $255,000 in tax revenue at the $17, our current tax rate. So 255 for 5 units, or the 12 at Patton Ridge give you, 3/5 of it. But the point is that with cottage housing, you're not going to get the values that you had at Patton Ridge, but you will have more density and smaller, and you will have several hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit, and so you will get some sizable revenue. And smaller units, the developers were saying that we didn't need to put cottage housing into a senior element, because they said that it's sort of self-selecting. By having 2 bedrooms and really small lots, you're not going to get your typical family move in. You will get some, but they said the design of it by default sort of just minimizes a little bit the school-age children impact.
Do you have a sketch plan of what was proposed?
I do, but it's not relevant anymore. I mean, today's discussion is about what you want.
One other question, doesn't the ECTA still have trail easements through the Peary? Even the 5, even under the 5?
3 years ago, one of the landowners broke the trail, stopped the trail loop going through, and I don't know how that was resolved. I know it was a big issue. Even people on the property, and the Essex County Trail has had trails going into the property, and they had a trail easement going across the little narrow land bridge over to Bridge Street. But the interior loop was broken by one of the families. I don't know the background of it, but I know 3 years ago that it was not, even for them, it was not a constant loop anymore.
So I guess we need to get back to the overall purpose here.
Yeah, what are we trying to accomplish?
Right. And to me, and I don't know exactly how it's worded, but, creating some flexibility, right, and what is there. And I know Tom Ford had wanted this, and I've said this before, across the street at Esdale's, was how to make it flexible and how to make, have different potential uses, like Mark was talking about, senior and non-senior and cottage and, cluster. I mean, right. Having a number of things happen on one property potentially. How is that most succinctly worded? That would be one main purpose I would have. Different housing types and not uses, but in different ages, different housing types on the same lot.
So maybe it would be.
So when you say different housing types, you mean smaller houses?
Again, different, right? So you could have senior housing, you could have cluster, you could have cottage, you could have
Single family.
Yeah, right.
And any combination thereof.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I wonder if it would be useful to the group to try and come up with sort of maybe a 4 or 5 key elements that we're trying to accomplish here in terms of, if we establish what the goal is, then we can start formulating some specific ideas on how to reach that goal.
Right.
But we keep, all of us have a different vision here. And even individually, I'm not sure we have a coherent vision, so I'm wondering if it might make sense to sort of see if we can lay out some key principles that we'd like to accomplish here, and then use those principles as guideposts to get us to something that we can agree on.
Rick, I think there are 6 good ones already there.
I mean, they're not bad, and
No, not at all.
I mean, it does allow a number of different types of dwellings. It doesn't specifically say cottage, right? It doesn't say senior.
For
Yeah, I mean,
It's
Yeah, I think we can.
Oh, well, that, yeah, okay. Yeah, I was in the usage.
I think we could get rid of, particularly for the older persons, since we now have a senior housing bylaw. I mean,
Right.
this predated the senior housing bylaw.
I had a note to that effect, too. There's no point to carry that any longer.
So, as Richard pointed out, are these things that, can we agree these are the key elements of what we're trying to achieve here?
Well, I'm going
I
to,
mean, I guess I question number 5. Negative fiscal impact on the town associated with conventional residential development.
Yeah.
This town runs off of, houses that are averaged $550,000, that have 0.4 children in the school, and that's how the town balances its budget. And if you build houses that are bigger than that, then, have more children. I don't see necessarily anything in our current development pattern that is creating fiscal deficits.
Well, I'll give you an example of the house that was built behind me.
You have to do this for the town
No,
as a
I-
whole.
I get it.
Everybody has a house that's a surplus
Can I answer
or a
the
deficit.
question?
let him finish, please.
Can I just answer
Stop
the
interrupting.
question? You take an acre or 2 acres, you build a $1 million house on it, you have 2 or 3 kids in the school system, you're already at a negative fiscal impact on the town.
Oh, you're
That's-
just about breaking even.
That's what we're at.
You're breaking even.
No.
Ask the school board, $8,000 a kid, and that house will generate 1.7,
No.
it'll generate $17,000 a year in tax
Right,
revenue.
and 3 times,
Right,
what,
so
what's
3
3
times.
times, shoot, just let me finish. What's 3 times 8?
What?
What's 3 times 8?
We know what, we
Oh,
know what.
3
we know
kids
what-
in the school.
Please let me finish. What's
The
3
days of
times,
3 children,
what's 3 times 8, Bill?
24.
Right, and it's producing $17,000 in revenue. So you're negative on school costs, never mind police, fire, and operating of the town budget. So,
Assuming 3. The
okay,
number of
let's say,
households that have
let's say
3
2.
kids in this
Okay,
town
let's-
is a
let's say-
tiny fraction.
Bill, let's say 2.
Then it breaks even.
Okay, so it breaks even with school costs, but now you've got fire, police, you've got town operations. We have a finance committee that's coming up with many millions of dollars for capital expenses. We're going to be replacing.
I propose
Let me finish.
I understand.
We're going to replace.
It's only 30%.
Let me finish.
30%.
Let him finish talking.
Bill, I'd like to have, you're a professor. I would think that you would want to engage in an informed dialogue between 2 people to come up with a consensus of what's going on here. So we have a lot of expenses coming up in this town. We are probably 2 years away from overrides. So we need to be coming up with revenue, and we need to be coming up with revenue from, and the only source we have now is residential. So if we're going to do this, revenue is important, and you've pointed that out. It's great if you have a $2 or $3 million house. That's wonderful, but that's not what people are building now. They're building in somewhere between 9 and 1.1. So they may be revenue neutral, or they may be slightly negative. They're eating up a lot of land, and as Mark pointed out, they chop up neighborhoods. So we're trying to figure
What's
out a
the
way
answer?
to.
Your answer is to have a cluster
Well, I'm trying
where
to.
you can put 3 houses in a little cul-de-sac or something or other and be very close to each other and get a little bit better tax rate tax yield than you would before, but
If we can, yes, that would be the ideal. I mean, the senior housing, Bill, you're always advocating
but the
the
50%
single-family
unused
house.
land is impossible to meet.
I'm sorry?
We know that.
The
We know that. Yeah.
I think we're speaking
It's
out of
written here
ignorance.
in the bylaw that 50% of the thing
Okay,
has some
so
common
maybe
open space.
maybe that's not something that we want to incorporate. So remember, we said, let's start with a fresh page of paper and say, hey, what do we really want this to do? So is that something that this bylaw should do? I haven't preconceived notion here, Bill. I'm just saying, I know you have a real focus on single-family housing. That's great. as one component of our bylaws for.
I would
building.
like to see a study. I've said this twice since I've been on the board. A study of all the new houses that have been sold in the last 5 years, single family, multifamily, whatever, how many children each of these houses has, so we can once and for all answer two questions: whether or not the single-family housing being built, which I agree is somewhere between $900 and maybe $1.3 million, okay, whether in fact it actually has 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 on average across all the developments, children in the school system, whether it's a fiscal drain or a fiscal surplus. And I would like to look at the couple of more dense developments that we've done, like the Junction development, and see whether in fact, as was originally anticipated, there were going to be only very few children in the school system, or whether in fact those developments actually have a lot of children in the school system, in which case they're running a huge deficit. I don't know.
Right.
But what we do is we all make our presuppositions,
Right.
okay? And with a little bit of research, we can answer this question.
Yeah.
Well, but the other part,
And then
you have to
we
consider
would
is-
have an answer to it.
right, the other part you have to consider is you can't just build for one segment of the population at 1,000,001 and up, and not have anything for anyone else that can't afford that, right? I mean, you want, well, maybe you don't, but
You want,
some
you want
people
diversity.
some people want some, at least economic diversity, in town. And yeah, there are houses obviously that are less than that, but not most of them are old. Most of them need work, and the Junction did serve some purpose.
Well, it's a 40D.
I know. Right. But obviously, different types of housing serve different purposes, and there's nothing wrong with having that in our town. I know some people would disagree, but
Right.
But we have to be, I mean, remember, the rush to senior housing here is because so many people say that, oh, we have, a population that's aging, we need to support them and provide senior housing. Yet all the senior housing projects in town are primarily purchased by people who don't live here. That's
Right.
all right.
Right.
But we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that there's a domestic need for senior housing, which these projects are meeting. They're not. They're
Not at that price
selling
point.
out to
Not at that
to
price,
seniors from
not at that price
other
point.
towns.
Not at that price point. You're right.
So,
So the only way you get to the price point that might be more attractive to people like me would be in the, $400,000 to $500,000 range.
Going to have real trouble building housing at that price without some
you have
form
some
of
density.
Comes with
subsidy.
density. It comes with
density
density.
is the answer to keeping the price down. With regard to the initial fiscal impact, where this part started, way back when, may or may not be relevant, the fiscal impact we were trying to mitigate was not just the cost of students in the school system, but by having smaller roads, thinner roads, less to plow, less to supervise. When you go to repair your roads, you're repairing shorter distances of roads that are usable. The idea was also to have smaller, more impervious surfaces. Sorry, whatever. By having fewer roads, we had better stormwater issues, and so the conventional subdivision approach basically ate up a lot of land, spread out a lot of resources, was very costly when it got old. And you can look at some of the older subdivisions that we have in town. Now they're coming back to the community and saying, will the town accept those roads as town-owned roads because the infrastructure is so poor, and if the roads were shorter and thinner and more tightly controlled, the town might be willing to take on that cost. But it's pretty expensive. So the fiscal impact was not just students. I think we have about 40% of our households have kids in them, and which is not quite square with the fact that the average tenure in town is about 13.5 to 15 years. School, if someone runs through the whole school system, it's 12 years. So you get a couple of years on either end on average of people paying the taxes and not having the cost burden. So Rick, that's not exactly supporting your point, and a little bit more towards Bill's. But if you have people who are longer term And in Hamilton, we have our average tenure is actually much longer than adjacent communities. People move here and never leave, which is great. But it means that there are many years where they're paying the full tax rate without having a large cost burden. That said, it's really expensive to move in. One of the exciting things about senior housing is not necessarily that it creates space for seniors if they want to, and I think we do have the number of people at Patton that came from Hamilton. It was only like a third. It wasn't it was like 3 or 4 of the houses were local. But it also created a lot of backfill opportunities. It gave a chance for young families to move into the houses that people move out because it is expensive. People move out because of our tax rate. We hear that every day. People complaining about that the costs they claim to move out. I'm not quite sure the stats support it as much, but we certainly have seen a lot of young families move in, which has been really beneficial to our community in non-economic ways. And the whole vitality that comes with young families as being a place that's family centric really is very positive for the long-term health of the town, and it's not just economics. So I appreciate you guys are setting public policy for open space, and you're setting public policy for density. There's economic diversity that we need. It's not just housing type diversity, but we need to have price points that are lower so that older people can stay in town, keep their networks together. The Patton or the Boulders are not going to give you that option. So, and the only way you can get the land cost spread out is to have smaller footprints, more density on smaller footprints. I think where the smallest unit is, suppose you have a cul-de-sac of 12 houses and one of them happens to have 5 acres. Could they become, one of these? I think that's a more important issue than just 5 acres somewhere randomly, because that could actually be disruptive, that density smack in the middle of a cult. So I think some of the issues that you have to think about are more than just, do we want small, 10 acres, 5 acres, or whatever. It's, the where and the how.
The problem with this is there's no open space parcels that we're going to find lying around that can be preserved under this potential draft bylaw. It's never been used, and it probably never will be, because I don't think we see it. On the estates, if we really reworked that and had, every big estate where there's 40 acres of land, let's say, you could have some division of it and have a development of this kind of thing on part of the estate, and then the big manor house. And
I think your example right across the street, the Esdale property, when it came up, is probably a perfect example of that. It's large enough, it was over the hill, so a lot of what would have happened there was not visible, wouldn't have impacted drive-bys, but it was still not enough economics to be worth the hassle of going through a special permit.
that's right.
And so, it's a balance that you guys are paid the big bucks to figure out. But I think that's a very good example of a property that was large enough to trigger this. You had real developer interest. You had someone who wanted to. So Ms. Desdale was all about saving open space, but she was also trying to get some economics out of it.
But he rejected OSFPD for sure.
Because of the structure of
Right,
there wasn't
because
the
of the structure,
density
yeah, right.
wasn't flexible enough
Yeah.
for him. So Tom's input is going to be very valuable.
He really rejected it, I think, because of the price. At $5 million, okay, he just had trouble thinking of building anything at almost any density that could justify that. When he comes in here, you ask him how much he normally likes to have into the land as a percentage of the total developed value, and he'll tell you it's like 10 or 15%. Now, he can't pay $5 million for that land. If $5 million is going to be 15% of what he puts in it, he'll have to put in, $25 million, and there's not enough he can build there.
That's right. So if the bylaw was written in a way so that the estate house could be sold for 2.5, he locks up the thing for 5, he sells off the
I know, but it still didn't,
I completely agree with you.
because the price was too high.
We'll find out from him.
We'll find it. We'll ask him. He'll come in and say.
But I
I think that's
high-
what he'll tell you.
We have put people into a perception that high land prices are the cost of doing things. I mean, even look at Phil Hansberry when he tried to sell his property. Any reasonable use, he couldn't end up selling it. And as a result, the tree farm guy came in, and we now have a tree farm in our downtown, or tree service downtown, because operationally he could afford the price of buying it when anybody else with a development plan couldn't. Right? So you sometimes, anyway, I'm rambling. I apologize, but I mean, you're dealing with the right issues.
I don't think you were rambling that badly. I think you were good.
Well,
Rambler is here.
back to the purpose. I mean, we can get rid of number 5 completely, honestly.
Right.
Or just stop it after housing choices.
Yeah.
Number 5, I said. But yeah, stop number 4 after housing choices. Number 5, I think you can get rid of completely.
Yeah, I think you could say in
I would
6,
support that.
You could say in 6 is option to landowners who wish to see a continuation of their stewardship of the land. Or you could take it out entirely. I mean-
Protect permanently open space or permanently protect open space.
Yeah, that needs to be flipped, I
Yes.
think.
So Laura, what do you think? I haven't heard anything from you.
I agree that I think it'd be interesting to see the study or look at the data, at least so we can all see that. I mean, is that something we can get access to?
So do you think these goals are appropriate?
I think they are, but I think always having more information is good.
This is true.
Because it may cause us to think more creatively.
And what kind
Or
of
not.
what kind of information would you need?
So Bill is saying the study of how many houses have been sold in the past 5 years, and what sort of tax revenue they're producing, or what size land parcels they are, the cost of those properties, and then how many children. I mean, it would be just interesting to see like what's been happening. And then say, is this something we want to continue, or are we trying to steer it so that something else happens?
So that certainly would be one data point. I don't know if is that kind of information we can get that's readily available and easy to get?
I will try.
The trick is tying it to the school, number of kids in school.
Right.
That's the hard part, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure we would know how to find that out.
So town clerk actually has that information, but is not by law allowed to give it to you. Because it includes.
The assessor can give you all the recently
property.
sold houses and, you know.
easy,
I thought you said recently built houses. Recently
Yes,
sold.
we built and sold, yep. They're on the books. The problem would be matching up data on children in school. I don't know whether the
Right,
school
that's what he
rolls.
That's what he just said.
Right. I don't know whether that's public domain or not.
He just said it isn't.
Yeah, so the clerk's not allowed to give information out on children under 18. So when they take their census database, so you look at our occupant list by street.
The street listing?
The street listing has sort of,
Right.
you're as a professor and you're as a retired, whatever the listing is, there are no children there, or no children under 18 on that list by state.
How about the school committee? Maybe they would like to know on their own. They just give us a roster, 3 children at number 14 Bridge Street.
They might be able to give you the aggregate. They might be able to say, for these properties, here's the aggregate number of kids.
Yeah. Exactly.
They might, if they
But these are the addresses with 1, 2, and 3 kids, right?
But what advantage would they gain by giving the information?
Because then we would
No, would they gain, not what we would.
answer the question that they're interested in.
So that's sort of a key question, because if we can't get that information, then this kind of study is going to yield nothing that's of value to us. So is that a question you can ask the school department?
I will.
Um,
I don't know what response I'll get, but I will try.
Well, we won't know until we ask.
So what's the question going to
Well,
be, Rick?
how do we want to, do we want to say all the houses sold in the last 5 years? Or do we want to limit it to, like, I know at one point you said newer homes, I mean, whether they're built in the last 5 years? Or,
If we match the school enrollment to addresses from the assessors, then we can ask 5 different versions of the question.
well, but,
All the recent houses, all the big houses, all the little houses, anything you want. How many kids are in the
well,
school?
but that's going to vary. Those kids in a house might vary over those 5 years, so.
No, but it's just getting some sense about what the current market is, whether people who are moving in town have way, way, way more than the average number of children, whether the people moving in bigger houses have more kids than people moving in smaller houses. That's a sort of presumption throughout here, and I don't know if that's true. So, we'd answer all those questions, but we'd have to merge the assessor's data with some database from the school system.
I'm getting the idea that this is going to be way too complicated and give you no information at all.
Actually.
If they're willing to
Well,
share the data.
if they can
it's not-
share, it's not
It's
too
pretty
bad.
easy.
It's just a matter of access to the data. The math and looking at the correlations is simple.
Okay, so I guess we'll find out from Patrick's.
I mean, maybe we could get the finance committee to chip in. They don't really have a budget.
No.
They're probably also interested in it. I mean, number of town offices are would be interested in that.
You say a lot of things that are very vague and don't have any substance to them. There aren't a lot of offices in town that would be interested in that. That's a strange statement.
Well, we'll find out based on Patrick's question.
Anyway, what I'm gonna do is bring the lists of all the properties in town that are greater than 10 acres, and bring that in and go over it with Patrick, and we'll see where they are. How many are in the greatest states? I think there's like 17 or something.
So we
Very
can,
few of them have been divided. That's where the supply of land is, still in those greatest states, I believe. But we're not gonna find 10-acre parcels sitting around.
well, again, I think this really comes down to, the core issue here is density.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's density on whatever size property we're talking about, whether it's 10 acres, whether it's 5 acres, whether it's 1 acre.
Well, I don't see that, I don't get what you do with 1 acre or 5 acres.
Do a lot. We could put
Well,
4 houses on 1 acre.
Well, let's look at what you just.
Is it gonna be
Peter,
attractive? Is it gonna be
Well,
saleable?
my house is saleable and my house is attractive, so
could
the
I
answer is
finish?
yes.
Could I finish the discussion?
Sorry,
here?
Rick.
Look at what you just approved for the HDC. You just approved 22 bedrooms on 1 acre.
Yeah.
So that answers your question, what you can do on 1 acre. Now, do you want to do that all
But
over?
that's an office building, and
It's not an office building, it's a mixed-use, 3-story building with 2,400 square feet of commercial space, which is about 10% of the all-usable space in that building. So you don't want to be doing that all over town. But I'm just saying, as an example of what you can do on 1 acre, you could put, I don't know, half that number on 1 acre.
Well, and like at the other end of Willow Street, you have 7 condos on 1 acre.
Right.
They're large condos.
where are they?
Right across from,
Willow condos,
yeah, Willow and Asbury.
across from Lamson.
Oh.
For
They've been there for
30
years.
years.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And you could easily have 14 there because they're so big, they're 3,500 square feet apiece.
Right.
You could have 14 units there and you would never know.
So that's really the,
But here's an important part, I think. The people in that area, I think, very much value the density that's already there. The small lots, 4,000 square feet, there's probably, 7, 8, 9 units per acre, if you look at gross density in the area. And I think they were supportive of new development at that level, whether it's clustered or whether it's, something that looks very much like what's there now. I think they got a little worried when we put 18 to the acre. I think the people who were here were quite negative. I sensed a lot of negativity,
Of course they are.
and it's if we'd only put, 7 or 8 or 10 units in that development, I think it would have had a lot more support.
We wouldn't have gotten, it would not have been economically viable. So.
Well, it'll be economically viable at some price,
Well,
at some value of the land, sure.
Yeah, and that's why we pegged it at that number of units. Because we did a market analysis and found out what the market was demanding, and we know what the cost of the land is, and we know what our cost of going through the planning board for site plan review. So, as I said, the point here is density. Now, we know that people won't like density. Nobody likes change in this town. Everybody wants it to stay the same, and they want to, protect their neighborhood and their assets, and I get that. That's all, these are all key issues that we're going to run into. It was the same thing with the senior housing bylaw. As I've monotonously told you, it took 3 town meetings before it was approved, and, we had, God knows, dozens and dozens and dozens of meetings, and, angst over, this was going to ruin the town, and it was going to change the character, and, it was going to be awful. Well, not so awful. It is a change. People don't like change. I mean, we had the neighbors on Sherman Road. Is it Sherman Road? Sharon Road. They were very concerned about it. But eventually, after 3 years of discussions, we got to a project that they actually, they weren't happy about it, but they come to accept it because it was something that they had a lot of input into, and a lot of thought and care was put into the design and the landscaping and the drainage, and so it is a tough process. So if your key issue is going to upset people, then we might as well go home and stop right now, because anything we do here is going to upset somebody.
Well, there are 2 ways it would upset people. I mean, I think your point, my view is that the board should represent the opinions of the town. The board should not represent on any development the opinions of the neighbors, because nobody likes development on a piece of land next door to them. That's just, that goes without saying,
Right.
okay?
Right.
But on the other hand, if the people in the town have a general preference, not related to their own backyard or the backyard next door, have a general preference for lower or higher density, we're elected officials. We should try and honor that.
No,
We couldn't.
in some ways I agree. It's just, it depends on what you define as, the will of the town, right? Some people say, oh, it's those 20 people that come to the meeting, that's the will of the town. Well, no, that's not really the case.
Right, and I think that's the thing we need to remember. There are 5,000, no, it's bigger than 5,640 registered voters in the town. If we see 2% of those during a discussion like that, that would be amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That would be amazing.
No, but for example,
So-
in the town meeting 2 years ago where Cottage Housing got shot down like 5-1,
Yeah.
we don't know whether that was a representative sample or not, but that was such an overwhelming defeat.
Yeah.
I would be quite sanguine about, that kind of proposal in the future. I would say, based on that town meeting, there was no support for it at all.
Oh,
You have to.
And you could have said that for the senior housing.
So-
when it-
Exactly.
On the-
So, go ahead.
If I may, on the cottage housing bylaw that was proposed, right before that had been, Sean Farrell had run a refresher of the housing survey, and in that survey, there was actually overwhelming support for cottage housing. So I think the ability of people to articulate certain elements of the actual plan fell apart, and it did not have the support. But the concept of
no.
cottage housing was overwhelmingly supported in concept. The trick is to find a way to balance the theoretical approval that people
Actually,
have
the
for
most
cottage.
recent survey was pretty well split down the middle in terms of the fraction of respondents who supported cottage housing, and the town meeting had 300 people in it, and it was 5-1 against it. I don't, and the number of people who filled out the survey was only 600, so.
Which is astonishing number.
I think we're in a very uncertain area here.
Of course we are.
Right.
So the Willow Street condos is probably a very good example of what density looks like, at 7 per acre, or something else. And so the way this bylaw is written is that you have this base density and then you have these bonuses. And it could be that you have single family dwellings and there's no concept of allowing more density because it's single family. But it could be that there's more density if it's cottage styles, and you could define that as in a design that's acceptable to this board and future versions of this board, and square footage per unit of, X number of bedrooms on average, no more than 2.5 bedrooms, so you can define what cottage means in some gross ways and allow it as conditional extra density as a reward. But I think you don't want to necessarily just give the extra density outright, because then you could end up having the wrong density prepared in the wrong way, and it's really hard for this board, once someone has a formal plan in front of you with the engineering, to say no. You want to sort of reason on, you end up somewhere in between. So by putting it as bonuses for doing everything right, then maybe you can sort of steer it towards people willing to.
I would actually support what Peter suggested, which is, maybe we have the cart before the horse. So we sit down and we go through the map, and we have a map made up and we identify 10 plus acre parcels.
Well, I think that's where you're going wrong already, is I think you gotta lessen that number.
What?
I mean, you can start at 10, you can start at 5.
Well,
I mean,
I'm just saying,
right.
all the proposals use 10. So, we start at 10 and we identify, we highlight 25 and above with red and with different colors, and we see where there are potential sites. And then we think about, what do we want to do with those sites? What would we like to see done on those sites? Some of them might be perfect for densification, some of them might not be. And then we try and tailor, all right, a system of zoning that meets our objectives. And rather than doing it in the abstract, right, without reference to what parts of town are we talking about, which sites, and how would it work?
Well, you're actually mirroring what I suggested at the beginning of this process, is that we take a theoretical property, and in this case, we can take several theoretical properties and start applying various criteria to them to see how that plays out.
But I might feel differently about, this applied to a property in one part of town as opposed to another. The parts of town having very different values, say, for other open space that was surrounding it.
Yeah, but how can you do that? I mean, it's way too subjective.
Yeah.
No,
I think you have to look at it in every part of town. I think you have to look at it in every district, well, other than business district, but, have a property or whatever in each.
Well, you don't want to do spot zoning. You can't do spot zoning.
I'm not saying that.
But I'm not advocating spot zoning either. I would just like to understand a little more, where are 10-acre parcels, where are 20, where are 30, which parts of town have the most that might be subject to this, and how much do we think open space is needed in that part of town or some other part of town? I'd just like to know what we're up against.
Well, and
So
Again, though,
that'll give us a sense of the potential inventory as it's currently
That's right.
as it's currently defined here. But I'm not locking into this, model of 10 acres or more.
I wouldn't either until I looked at what was out there.
We can look at, inventory down to 6 acres or whatever. It's go to
Right.
smaller parcels.
Yeah.
And there'll be quite a number of those, but they're usually very stressed because they're very wet, or there's a stream coming through, or, there's all kinds of things that have kept it as 6 acres, which is.
But it's really not eligible for development.
Yeah.
And then other part, and there are other
There are very few
parts of town
farms
where it's
that
all
have
developable.
open land.
So the trick that we always struggled with, and not to say you can't struggle with it again, is how to define invisibility. So if you think of the secret of the maples in Boulder, you'd have no idea that there are 54 units up over that hill. It has the visual impact and the traffic is negligible, and 54 units, that's a huge number. Of 53, whatever the number is, it's big. It's a big number like that, but yet it's invisible. And that was, one of the benefits of Peary is that a lot of that was invisible. It was really the traffic impact, and that was the real value. But it's also like Esdale was invisible. A lot of the development would have been invisible to the street. Streetscape would have stayed the same. You would have had a traffic impact. So the smaller property that you get, a 5-acre property, is fine to consider, but it should be up to this board to disqualify it because it's too visible. It had too much of an impact on the community or the immediate neighborhood. Because everything it's visible from it may be visible from so many different directions.
But in some cases, depending on the neighborhood, the visibility may not be an issue.
Absolutely, and that's why I said you have to struggle with what it is. The more invisible it is, the easier it is to find a way to permit it and get it past the neighbors. But that's something to think about as you write this to being applicable for smaller parcels. Just increase your awareness of impact on community.
Yeah, because some of these where they want to call them cluster or cottage or whatever are actually, in some communities, quite visible. There may be some open space around it, but the actual units might be quite visible. And that might not be a bad thing in some cases.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think you have to hide these things. They just need to be well designed. If you can hide them, fine. But if you can't, that's not a negative.
That depends on the town. It has to. I mean,
Well,
there's some
depends on the
towns are
area.
very developed, and you don't try and hide development at all. It fits into the
But no, I'm saying-
streetscape and the cityscape and everything else. And other towns are much more rural, and you want to hide them. So, because that's the way the town's developed, and that's
But
the way
again,
people
it's all
feel.
about the design too. You can have something that's on a farm, an old farm, that's some large building that might look more like a farm building. There'll
Absolutely.
be a bunch of units. So there's all kinds of ways to do this.
Yeah, you barnscape something and it
still
looks
make
like it fits in.
visible.
The example we looked back then was the Concord Cottage Housing.
Yeah.
Right, so there are 2 or 3 buildings up front, so it wasn't invisible from the street, but the topography of the land fell back away, so you didn't from the street feel all the density because it basically fell down and away. So each, it was an appropriate density there because of the topography.
So the other thing that, I think we've got 5 sort of key criteria here. We've got a couple of things. Patrick's going to check on this, whether we can get any kind of meaningful information from the school department on housing. Peter's going to see if he can identify, 10 properties or whatever, the whole list of properties of 5 acres or more that are around town. And the other thing we might want to think about is, are there other examples of, and I'm going to just say cluster housing as a generic term, that other towns like Hamilton have enacted, that we can look at and see if there are any models?
I'm sure there are.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. Must be
So I don't know if you have listserv.
lots of those.
There was and I've sent this out 2 or 3 times, a
MAPC,
zoning
something?
bylaw that Mark Bobrowski created, and actually Wenham adopted it. It's called flexible zone, and he had discussed that with us a few years ago at great length, and we decided to push that off to our second stage or second
Can you
level
get a copy of it
process.
so we can read it?
I've sent it out to all the members. I'll do it again, Peter.
Yeah, I'm just not on the list of members, that's the problem. I
Well,
need to-
you have been.
So
Fell off the back end.
I'm not sure how much farther we can get with this until we sort of have some of that basic
No, that's
data.
fine.
So,
Some of that info.
I think the same thing should hold on the estate bylaw. I would really, really like to see identification of the big estates. I mean, some we all know.
we have that.
We have that.
We have
Yeah,
that.
we have that, and Marcy Ricker wrote up a per estate analysis of the lands and flexibility, and Susan, Susan Colorado Mansfield went with Marcy to talk to the estate owners and see what the state
Was there a-
plans were.
Document?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
We send that around again?
I don't think it's in the planning office. I think they will have to
It's not
find it
electronic.
there. Or I can call Marcy and just find out where it went. But
Yeah, she and Susan Colorado Mansfield have offered to come and talk us through, that bylaw. But, as you've seen tonight, it's hard enough for us to focus on one and make headway on it. So I think spreading ourselves too
I don't
thin
wanna
is
start that.
probably not the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Thanks,
This is going to probably take 6 months to.
Okay.
Yeah, depending on when we can, how quickly we can get information and put it together.
May I make one observation on the text of the bylaw that was sent around dealing with open space? So our town Concom has no budget to maintain open space, and yet we know that.
Going to delete that.
That's gone.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Right.
it's might as well be not being
Patrick.
maintained.
Yeah, Patrick made that
Yeah,
argument.
we had flagged that to, a good example. There's property along Boardman that was part of a project there years ago that is now under the care and custody of the town. And, trees are falling, et cetera, and the expectations are that the town comes out there, cleans it up, fixes everything else. That's just, that's an unattainable expectation.
The analysis of Patton Ridge is the same way. The town has ownership under the senior housing bylaw of the Patton Ridge, a lot of the Patton Ridge acreage, and yet the Conservation Commission has no budget to maintain the land that's
Right.
been assigned to them. And it's just a mismatch of,
Resources.
well, particularly when you have to maintain, is a tree sick? You have to evaluate it. You can't just send the DPW out there to cut it down.
Patrick, I'm interested in what you were saying about Boardman, because Boardman has a land that is maintained by the Hamilton Wenham Open Lands Trust,
Right.
which is the pond and
Which-
so forth. But then there were just 3 trails that went off, and there's a space between the houses, but it's very small. And
Yeah, the way that language was written, that property comes to the town in the absence of that trust. That trust is no longer a viable entity,
meaning the Hamilton Wenham.
meaning
Open
they
Lands
no longer have a mailing address. They no longer have
Trust. Didn't know
members.
that.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, let me try and figure out who would be the persons that would take
Thank you,
over.
Mark.
No,
Thank
thank
you.
you guys all for struggling with this. It's not going to be easy. They're going to go through some tough times, but it's the right struggle. Good luck.
Good night, Mark.
Okay. I think we have Mark
You said the Hamilton Wenham Land Trust
Yeah.
had, I've talked to one of the people that is involved with that, and it
Well,
still
you said it's
exists, but
gone.
it's in a, huh?
Patrick says it's gone,
Is it completely gone, Patrick? Have they given up their,
because they've got about 8 properties, 10 properties, all around the town.
Right.
yeah, George Tars is one of them.
Yeah. Well, Chris Davis used to be, and a lot of people.
Part of it.
I'd be interested to see if it just evaporated, but I haven't seen mail from it for about 10 years.
It seems to have dissolved. Well, it's easy to, actually, would it be under the Secretary of State?
Yeah, how was it formed? I mean, had there been some
Yeah,
VL or
I
24,
wasn't,
right?
that was way
Yeah, right,
before me.
Right.
No, I mean, that's easy to check on the Secretary's website, because after 10 years, if they're not filing reports, they're automatically dissolved.
Right.
Let's check with Marcy, she might know that.
All right, moving on.
Okay, second agenda item is the review of the Attorney General opinion regarding their approval of the Hamilton zoning bylaw. As all the board members are aware, this came up as a contested notion as the 59 to 63 Willow Street project was being proposed. That zoning and its process was called into question. As part of that, some of the interested parties pursued some inquiry with the Attorney General. As you will remember, I advised the board, the audience, and the watching public that, yes, in fact, the Attorney General had approved our zoning bylaw and all of the elements of it. I brought their original approval, or a copy of it, which is dated April 11th of 2017, if people want to read it. But I know that there were very eager individuals to have an understanding as to what the Attorney General's opinion was now. So based on that,
You know?
allow me to indulge me a bit, and I'll read the letter that came to the town. This is dated December 23rd, 2019, addressed to Sharon George, interim town clerk. Dear Miss George, on November 17th, 2016, this office received the bylaw amendments adopted under Article 3-1 from the October 22nd, 2016 Hamilton Special Town Meeting. Article 3-1 was a complete recodification of the town's zoning bylaws. More specifically, the town voted to replace existing bylaws with the language set forth in Appendix C of the 2016 Fall Warrant Book, with the amendments as voted by the Planning Board. In a decision issued April 11th, 2017, we approved in part Article 3-1. When they say in part, there was one minor clause in there that had to do with access to ZBA hearings that Attorney Mark Bobrowski and the AG's office had some level of disagreement on, and had in prior drafts and prior zoning bylaws and ordinances written by other communities through Mr. Bobrowski. So that was the only item that's part of any retraction that they had us pull out of a bylaw. Had nothing to do with mixed zoning, nothing to do with the business district. Let me continue. On December 6, 2019, this office received inquiries asking us to confirm whether a review of the November 17, 2016 bylaw submission included a review of the Planning Board amendments referenced in the town meeting vote on Article 3-1. One inquirer states that the Planning Board amendments were identified in a document entitled Errata Sheet. This errata sheet was not specifically referenced by title in the town meeting vote on Article 3-1, and the errata sheet was not included in the bylaw submission filed with this office by the town clerk in 2016. However, we have reviewed the errata sheet and have confirmed that all of the changes identified in the errata sheet were incorporated into the version of the town's zoning bylaws submitted by the town clerk in a document identified as Town of Hamilton zoning bylaw, first adopted 1954 including amendments up to October 22nd of 2016. As such, the answer to the inquiries is yes. The planning board amendments referenced in the town meeting vote on Article 3-1 were reviewed by this office and reflected in our decision issued April 11th, 2017. And again, that was a positive vote. Please feel free to contact this office with any questions.
So Rosie was wrong.
One of the things that I wanted to make people aware of, there's a very detailed process that cities and towns need to go through when planning boards have prepared an amendment to their zoning bylaw. And you'll see right immediately following that letter from the AG, it's called the Form 7. Every time a city or a town changes a zoning amendment, all of these questions have to be answered. You have to provide all the postings. You have to provide all of the hearings. You have to provide all of the dates, all of the published newspaper articles, etc., where other communities and the public have been notified, as well as dates when the regional planning agency has been notified, and in fact, even the abutting communities, cities and towns have been notified. So it's a pretty thorough process as part of that they expect of you. All of this gets done every single time that we make an amendment to our bylaw, including when we did it for the rewrite on October the 22nd of 2016. And it included the errata, it included the document, it included all of the information that was part of that package.
For following up and
Okay.
reading that into the record, so I think we can
Yep.
put that to bed.
Yeah, I think that's important for the public to know,
Yeah.
because that was a question that was raised and used as a instrument to try and discredit really the planning board in its processes, so.
Does the planning board, do you keep a copy of this every time it's filed, correct, Patrick?
Every time
The
one's
forms-
filed.
Electronically, I try to keep a copy of everything, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, so when that person did, the real thing is, that person should have gone and said, I want to see a copy of your Form 7 for whatever it was that person was looking for.
I think that person did contact the town clerk, and because our town clerk is an interim person, she hasn't been able to find a lot of the information that has been submitted over time.
So why did the person who was originally requesting the information, that person didn't know to come and ask you for the information?
I can't answer that.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving on, as part of board business, we have our 2019 annual report. I don't know if everybody's had a chance to have a look at that and go through it. Thank you, Richard and Patrick, for putting it together.
You're welcome. I have looked at it.
I know you have.
Teasing.
I don't know if everybody's had a chance to look at it or not, if we want to go through it tonight. I'll be honest, I skimmed through it. I've been crazy busy and haven't had a chance to really look at it closely. So I wouldn't mind waiting if we could till next time and have a better chance to review it. And I mean, it's pretty thorough, but I'd like to have a chance to review it.
Well, I can tell you we're already ahead of
Yeah.
the vast majority of other boards,
I'm sure.
so
I'm sure.
I appreciate Richard's chipping in to putting this together.
These usually come out in like April or May, I think, for most boards, right?
Thank you.
True.
Yeah, what I do is, I take,
We don't have to go through the process right now.
but it's real simple.
I know, but.
Yeah.
But we can talk about it next time.
Doesn't matter, we all want to thank him.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely want to thank him for doing it.
One quick question on this. This says Chris Shepherd was an associate member, but then it doesn't say that he left.
What did you
Yeah.
say? Laura?
It says Chris Shepherd and Laura Walsh were the two associate members in the beginning of 2019, but he wasn't here at the beginning of 2019, right?
I mean, I think he's technically still part of
Okay.
it, but.
Yeah, technically, he's still on the board. I have not received a formal notification that he
Oh.
no longer is.
So
Okay.
We gotta do that.
he needs to send that to us. And the other thing is, we need to start soliciting associate
Yes,
members.
I know.
Okay, so technically, that doesn't need to be changed.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. Minutes from the 17th, December 17th. Yeah, the minutes were fine, I thought. Anybody else have thoughts on the minutes, comments?
No, I read them, the parts that I could comment on,
Yeah, me too.
and they were fine.
Okay. You want to make a motion to approve?
I make a motion that we approve the minutes of December 17th, 2019.
Second?
Second. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimous, thank you. Any other items from other boards or reports or anything?
No.
Okay.
Make a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Just one
What I do
thing,
is
can
go
people
through-
keep, Richard,
Huh?
can you keep these maps? Because I think this is important when we actually start at some point talking about different parts of town and different locations. So I think it's a good way when we start talking about R1B, R1A, RA, what are we talking about and where it's located? So I had asked Patrick to put these together so we had them, so we could be talking knowledgeably, so please keep them.
What I do is, when we do this, I keep all of these, and I make notes here saying, approved, and then just, well, actually, I go do it as I go along. It's easier that way, but it's still a lot of work.
Such a chore at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Never seen him.
You guys, around the same time, but yeah, he didn't make it to many. Let's put it that
So
way.
he was an associate,
Associate,
but
yeah.
kind of just didn't.
Yeah, he has trouble making the meetings. I think he